The living room of the Moretti estate on the Upper East Side was the kind of quiet that money buys and silence keeps. 6 stories of limestone above Fifth Avenue, 30 rooms behind reinforced walls, and yet at this hour of the afternoon, the only sound in the entire house was the soft ticking of a hand-wound clock on the mantel and the distant, muffled hum of Manhattan traffic somewhere below the sealed windows. On the long black leather sofa in the center of that room, Alessandro Moretti was asleep. He had not meant to fall asleep. He had meant to sit down for a moment. He had meant to close his eyes for the length of one deep breath, the way a man closes his eyes when the world has been pressing on him for too long and he needs a single second of dark before he can face the next hour. But his body, ignored for 4 straight nights, had made the decision for him. His head had tipped sideways against the cushioned armrest. His mouth had gone slightly open, and the man that most of the city feared had, for the first time in what felt like months, simply gone still. He was 38 years old. He was the head of the Moretti family, the man whose name moved through the ports of Brooklyn like a low tide, the man who controlled every card that was dealt in 3 of the largest private casinos in Manhattan, the man whose signature quietly sat behind more real estate on the East Side than most people would believe. For weeks, there had been a silent war with the Salvatore family over a stretch of shipping docks along the Brooklyn waterfront. There had been meetings that ended at 3 in the morning. There had been decisions that had cost men their lives. There had been phone calls he could not delegate and information he could not trust to anyone but himself. His white dress shirt was creased at the sleeves. His tie hung loose and half untied around his neck. On the leather armchair beside the sofa, his black suit jacket was folded, and inside the shoulder holster tucked into that jacket, the small dark shape of a handgun sat quietly against the silk lining. Even in sleep, the weapon was within reach. That was the life he had built. That was the life he had chosen. He did not know that on the other side of the low coffee table, no more than a few steps from where he lay, there was a very small human being watching him. She was 3 years old. She wore a yellow raincoat that was slightly too big for her, buttoned all the way up to her chin because she had refused to take it off when her mother arrived that morning. Her hair was dark and soft and pulled into 2 uneven pigtails. On the table in front of her, she had carefully laid out a plastic watercolor set her grandmother had sent from Puerto Rico in a padded envelope the week before, along with a small cup of water and a folded paper towel. Her name was Emma. Emma was studying the sleeping man on the sofa, the way children study things that adults have forgotten how to look at. Not with fear, not with judgment, just with the quiet, honest curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend she does not see. 2 floors above, her mother, Sophia Delgado, 32 years old, 4 months into her job as a housekeeper for a man she barely knew, was dusting a bookshelf and had absolutely no idea what was about to happen downstairs. He had power the whole city feared, but the one thing he truly needed, he didn't even know he was missing. Emma slid off the small cushion she had been sitting on and stood up. She did not make a sound. Children who spend a lot of time in quiet apartments learn how to move quietly, and Emma had been that kind of child for most of her small life. She looked once at the doorway to make sure her mother was not coming, and then she picked up her paintbrush, held her plastic cup of water in her other hand very carefully, and walked toward the sofa. She stopped a step away from the sleeping man and studied his face the way she had been studying him from across the coffee table. His mouth was slightly open. There was a faint shadow along his jaw where he had not shaved that morning. There was a small line between his eyebrows that had not gone away even in sleep, as though something inside him was still frowning even when the rest of him had given up. Emma did not have the words for any of that, but she understood it, in the way that 3-year-olds understand things without needing to name them. The man on the sofa looked sad, and in Emma's world, sad faces were a problem that could be fixed with color. She dipped her brush into the little tray of yellow. She was very serious about it. Her tongue slipped out of the corner of her mouth in concentration, the way it always did when she was drawing something important. She raised the brush. She held her breath. And then, with the slow, careful hand of an artist who has decided that this moment matters, she painted her first small yellow flower onto Alessandro Moretti's left cheek. He did not move. Encouraged, she leaned in closer. She rinsed the brush in her cup, patted it against the folded paper towel the way her grandmother had taught her, and dipped it into the blue. On the smooth, warm skin of his forehead, she painted a butterfly. The wings came out uneven, one larger than the other. But Emma nodded to herself. Butterflies did not have to be perfect. Real butterflies were never perfect either. Then orange, a small round sun on the point of his chin, with tiny lines radiating outward like the ones she drew at daycare, and along his jaw, a scatter of little orange dots, one after another, freckles made of sunshine. because Emma had decided somewhere in her small heart that a man with sunshine freckles could not possibly stay sad. Alessandro did not stir. His body, exhausted past the point where the mind could still stand guard, had sunk into a place of sleep so deep that even the faint, cool touch of the brush did not reach him. Emma stepped back. She tilted her head to one side, the way painters do in old films, and looked at what she had made. A flower, a butterfly, a sun, freckles. She smiled. It was a small, satisfied, private smile. The smile of a 3-year-old who believed, with absolute certainty, that she had just made the world a little bit better. Sophia came down the wide marble staircase carrying a silver tray. On it sat a porcelain teapot, a single cup, a small dish of lemon slices, and a folded linen napkin. She had prepared the tray the way she had learned to prepare it during her first week at the estate, everything angled just so, nothing touching, nothing loud. She was 32 years old. 4 months into a job she still could not quite believe she had been offered, and she had spent every one of those 4 months making sure she did not give anyone a single reason to send her away. She turned the corner at the base of the stairs and stepped into the living room. The tray fell from her hands. The crash of porcelain against marble was the loudest sound the house had made all afternoon. Shards of white china skidded across the polished floor. Tea spread in a slow, dark shape around her shoes. She did not notice any of it. She was not looking at the floor. She was looking at the sofa. Alessandro Moretti, the man whose name her friends in Queens whispered like a warning, the man whose home she cleaned 6 days a week, the most powerful man in a city that did not run out of powerful men, was asleep on his back, and on his face there were flowers. A small yellow flower on his cheek, a blue butterfly across his forehead, a tiny orange sun on his chin, freckles of sunshine along his jaw, and crouched beside the sofa, paintbrush in hand, was her daughter, Emma. The word came out of Sophia's mouth as a whisper first, and then as a sound with no shape at all. She crossed the room in 3 fast, unsteady steps, and dropped to her knees beside the coffee table. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not decide whether to grab the brush or grab the child. "Baby! Baby! What did you do? What did you do?" She remembered, in a flash that had nothing to do with logic, a story Vincent had once told her in the kitchen. A cook, years ago, who had broken a single one glass, and had been walked out of the estate before the end of the shift. She thought of her small apartment in Queens, the rent she had barely put together for the month, the little bedroom where Emma slept under a nightlight shaped like a moon, all of it, gone, because a 3-year-old had opened a paint set. Behind her, footsteps in the hallway, slow, then stopped. Vincent Romano stood in the archway. 62 years old, silver hair combed back, a dark suit pressed to knife edges. Around his neck, on a thin chain, hung the small silver crucifix that Alessandro's father had placed in his hand 30 years ago as a symbol of absolute trust. The crucifix trembled now, ever so faintly, against his shirt as his breath caught. Emma looked up at her mother with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She did not understand why Sophia was crying. She held up her paintbrush like an offering. "I made him pretty, Mama." On the sofa, Alessandro stirred. Sophia stood up, her back straightened. Whatever came next, she would take it. Alessandro opened his eyes. The first thing he felt was not sound or light. It was a faint coolness on his skin, in places where cool skin did not belong. Along his forehead, on one cheek, on the point of his chin. He blinked once, slowly, the way a man blinks when he is not yet sure which room he is in. He saw Sophia first. She was standing very close to the sofa, hands clasped in front of her, her face drained of color. He had known her for 4 months and had never once seen fear on her like this. Then he turned his head and saw the child. Emma stood at the edge of the coffee table, a small paintbrush still held in one hand, her yellow raincoat crinkling faintly as she breathed. Her eyes were huge and brown and completely unafraid. She looked at him the way she might have looked at a stray cat that had just woken up on her porch with interest, not caution. Alessandro raised his hand and touched his cheek. He drew his fingers away and looked at them. Yellow. He sat up. He said nothing. He did not look at Sophia. He did not look at Emma. He rose from the sofa in one slow motion, buttoned the top button of his shirt out of some old, automatic habit, and walked toward the archway that led into the hall. Sophia followed him without being told, her heart beating in her throat. At the far end of the hallway, above a narrow console table, hung an antique mirror in a heavy dark frame. Alessandro stopped in front of it. The man who had ordered the deaths of 8 enemies over the course of his life stood perfectly still and looked at himself, a small yellow flower on his left cheek, a blue butterfly, wings uneven, spread across his forehead, a round orange sun on his chin, a scatter of orange freckles along the line of his jaw. He lifted one hand slowly, and, with a fingertip that had held guns and pens and contracts and the shoulders of dying men, he touched the butterfly. Behind him, at the edge of the hallway, Vincent Romano had stepped back into the shadow of one of the marble columns. He did not want to be seen. He did not trust himself to be seen. Emma had followed the grown-ups down the hall. She was too small to understand tension, but she understood the mirror, and she wanted to see. She walked right up beside Alessandro's leg and tilted her head all the way back to look up at him. "You had a sad face when you were sleeping," she said. Her voice was clear and calm and completely certain of what it was saying. "So I made you pretty." Alessandro did not answer. His head bowed. His shoulders began to shake. Sophia felt her own breath stop, waiting for the anger she was sure was coming. Instead, a sound came out of him, a short, broken, disbelieving laugh. And then another, and with the laughter, silent tears, running down through the paint on his face, taking small streaks of yellow and orange with them. Sometimes the walls that guns and blood and money could never break are broken by a paintbrush held in tiny hands. Alessandro did not wash the paint off. He walked away from the mirror without saying a word to anyone, went back to his study, and closed the door behind him only halfway. On the other side of that half-closed door, Sophia stood in the hallway with Emma pressed against her leg, waiting for a decision that never came. Vincent Romano, still tucked into the shadow of the marble column, quietly stepped away. Inside the study, Alessandro sat down at his desk. He picked up his phone. He made 2 calls that afternoon, one to a shipping contact in Red Hook, one to a lawyer who did not know the meaning of daylight, and he made both of them with a small yellow flower, still painted on his cheek, and a blue butterfly still riding the line of his forehead. His voice on the phone was exactly what it had always been, steady, low, final. On the other end of the line, no one could see him. On his end of the line, he did not care. Marco Ricci arrived a little later, carrying a leather folder under his arm. He was the consigliere, a man who had served Alessandro's father before serving Alessandro, and there was almost nothing in this house that could surprise him anymore. He knocked once and pushed the study door open the rest of the way. He froze in the doorway. His boss, the head of the Moretti family, the man whose name closed doors in 3 boroughs, was sitting behind his desk with what looked like a child's watercolor painting spread across his face. Marco opened his mouth. He closed it again. Alessandro did not look up from the paper in front of him. "Sit down," he said. "Continue the report." Marco sat down. Marco continued the report. He did not ask. He would never ask. Later, when Alessandro finally stood at the marble sink in the powder room off the hall and slowly, carefully washed the paint off his face, he did not do it in a hurry. He watched the water run pale yellow, then faintly blue, then orange, down the drain. He watched a small piece of a sun disappear. He stayed there long after his face was clean. In the days that followed, something in the house began to shift. The door to Alessandro's study, which had been closed for as long as anyone on staff could remember, was left open, not all the way, just enough that light and voices could pass through. He said good morning to Sophia in the front hall, and this time his eyes actually met hers when he said it. He asked Emma, one afternoon on the stairs, about her stuffed rabbit. Emma informed him, with great seriousness, that his name was Sir Fluff and that he was afraid of the vacuum cleaner. A small watercolor painting appeared on the second shelf of the bookcase in Alessandro's study. A lopsided flower, an orange sun with too many rays. It was set carefully between the engraved crest of the Moretti family and a black and white photograph of Alessandro's father in a dark suit. Marco Ricci walked into the study, saw it, and said nothing. The meeting had run 4 hours. 3 men had flown in from Chicago that morning. 3 men who did not smile easily and did not agree to things without making everyone in the room work for it. They had sat across from Alessandro in the private dining room on the 2nd floor of the estate, and by the end of the 4th hour, all 3 of them had signed. Handshakes had been exchanged. A car had been called. The 3 men had been driven away into the Manhattan evening with the quiet, satisfied silence of people who had gotten a very good deal and knew it. Alessandro walked back down the wide staircase alone. He loosened his tie without pulling it off. He rolled his shoulders once, slowly, feeling the tension that had been sitting between his shoulder blades all afternoon begin, at last, to ease. He was tired, but it was not the sharp, hollow tiredness of the weeks before. It was a softer thing now, the tiredness of a man who had done a hard day's work and was allowed to sit down at the end of it. The living room had been prepared for him already. On the low table in front of the black sofa, a small silver tray had been set out. On the tray sat a bottle of Barolo, dark and heavy, with the year 1998 engraved into the label. It was the bottle Alessandro opened after important deals. Vincent Romano knew that. Vincent Romano had been the one to bring it up from the cellar an hour earlier and set it out with the care of a man who had done this many times before. Sophia carried the tray forward from the sideboard where Vincent had left it. She placed the bottle and a single crystal glass in front of Alessandro. She poured steady hand, a measured amount, just past the widest part of the bowl. "Will you need anything else, sir?" she asked. "A glass of water, please." She nodded once and left the room. For a small stretch of time, only 3 people remained in the living room: Alessandro on the sofa, Vincent by the sideboard, quietly arranging a small dish of almonds and dried figs onto a china plate, and in the corner of the hall, just beyond the archway, Emma, seated on the runner rug, whispering something into the soft ear of Sir Fluff. Emma glanced up, her eyes drifted, for no reason she could have explained, toward the silver tray. She saw something small, something quick, a flicker at the edge of her small vision, gone almost before it had registered. Her 3-year-old mind did not know what to do with the shape she had almost seen, so it did what 3-year-old minds do. It returned to the rabbit. Vincent stepped out of the room the moment Sophia's footsteps came back down the corridor. Sophia set the glass of water down on the tray beside the wine. She smiled faintly at Alessandro, a small, professional smile, and then quietly withdrew. Alessandro reached forward. He lifted the crystal glass. He turned it once in the light. He had no idea that the glass in his hand was already carrying something that wasn't wine. He raised the glass to his lips. He tasted the first note of the wine, that deep, rounded darkness he had known since he was a young man, the taste of cellars and old rooms and long nights of talk. Then, before the second note could arrive, something else came. A sharp, wrong heat at the back of his throat, as if he had swallowed a small piece of hot metal. 3 seconds. That was all it took. His hand began to shake. He tried to set the glass down and could not. His fingers loosened without his permission, and the crystal slipped from them. The Barolo glass struck the marble floor and shattered a bright, ringing crack that split the quiet of the room in half, and a spray of red wine bloomed across the pale stone. Alessandro went down onto one knee. His other hand flew to his throat. He tried to breathe and the breath would not come the right way. Sophia was already turning back through the archway with a folded cloth in her hand when she saw him. She screamed. It was a raw, high sound that did not belong to the polite housekeeper anyone had ever met. Marco Ricci came out of the study at a full run. He took in the scene in one glance: Alessandro on the floor, the shattered glass, the wine spreading toward his shoes, and his hand was already inside his suit jacket, already on his phone, already pressing the emergency sequence that only 3 people in the world knew. He did not shout. He did not panic. He pressed the sequence and knelt beside his boss and turned him gently onto his side so that whatever was in him would not choke him if it came back up. Dr. Elias Marchetti had answered the phrase Moretti emergency from the front seat of his car parked 2 blocks away, exactly where he had been quietly stationed for years. He was through the front door of the estate in what felt like no time at all. A black leather case already open in his hand, a prepared syringe already between his fingers. He knelt on the marble floor without a word. He pushed Alessandro's sleeve up. He drove the needle in. Then, he waited. Alessandro's body seized once a single hard convulsion that traveled the length of him and then stilled. His breathing, which had gone shallow and ragged, began to lengthen. His pulse, which Marchetti had his fingers on, steadied. Marchetti did not move for a long moment. Then he lowered Alessandro's arm back to the floor with something close to tenderness. Out in the hallway, he took Marco by the elbow and led him a few steps away from the doorway. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. 12 minutes later, he said, and we would have been carrying him out in a bag. That is a military-grade cyanide analog. It is not something you buy on a street corner. When Alessandro finally opened his eyes, the ceiling above him swam once and then settled. His throat still burned as if it had been scoured with wire. He had survived 3 assassination attempts in his life, but this one had come from inside his own house. Marco Ricci did not sleep. By the time the sky over Manhattan had begun to turn from black to the first slow gray, he had already pulled every camera feed inside the estate, sent 2 men to search Sophia's small locker in the staff quarters on the ground floor, and dispatched a second team across the East River to a walk-up apartment in Queens, whose address he had committed to memory the day Sophia had first been hired. Nothing about how he moved was rushed. Everything about how he moved was final. He returned to the estate carrying a black leather folder under his arm. Alessandro was awake now, propped against the pillows of the wide bed in his upstairs bedroom, an intravenous line still taped to the back of his hand. Dr. Marchetti had wanted him to sleep. Alessandro had refused. He had only agreed to remain in bed, and even that had felt like a concession. Marco stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He did not sit. He stood at attention beside the bed the way he had stood beside Alessandro's father in this same room years ago. 3 findings, he said. His voice was flat. It was the voice he used when he did not want emotion to change the shape of the facts. 1. The cellar corridor camera recorded exactly one person carrying the Barolo up from the wine room, Sophia Delgado. No one else touched that bottle in the 6 hours before it was opened. The footage is clean. There are no gaps in the timestamps. He turned a page in the folder. 2. In the housekeeping locker assigned to her on the lower level, we found a small glass vial. Blue, sealed, trace residue inside. Marchetti tested it downstairs an hour ago. It is the same military-grade cyanide analog that was in the wine. He turned another page. 3. In the apartment in Queens, in the bottom drawer of the small dresser in the child's bedroom, underneath a plastic bin of stuffed animals and coloring books, my men found $25,000, cash, small bills, rubber-banded, hidden. Marco closed the folder. The capos are waiting for your order. Alessandro did not answer. He turned his head slowly toward the window. The gray of the sky was beginning to gain a faint edge of gold at the horizon. Somewhere far above the East River, he looked at that thin line of gold and he did not see it. He saw a woman on her knees on the marble floor of his living room, hands shaking so badly she could not decide whether to grab a paintbrush or grab her child. He saw her standing up afterward, spine straight, ready to take whatever punishment was coming. He saw her placing a folded napkin on his tray, corner aligned to corner, because she had learned in 4 months that he liked his corners aligned. He heard, somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice saying, "I made him pretty, Mama." That woman, a woman who had brought her 3-year-old daughter into his house in a yellow raincoat because there was no one else to watch her. That woman was an assassin? The study was very quiet when Sophia was brought in. She stepped through the door with 2 of Marco's men behind her, not close enough to be holding her, but close enough that everyone in the room understood she was not free to leave. Marco stopped them just inside the threshold and dismissed them with a single, small motion of his hand. They stepped back into the hall. Marco pulled the door shut and stood against it. Alessandro was standing behind the walnut desk, both hands resting flat on its surface. He was fully dressed now, dark shirt, dark slacks, no jacket. His face was pale under the paint that was no longer there, and if a person knew where to look, they could still see the faint tightness in his throat from the burn of the night before. Sophia walked to the front of the desk and stopped. She folded her hands in front of her stomach the way she had been taught, years ago, to stand in front of people who could take everything from her. Her face was almost white. Her back was very straight. Alessandro laid 3 photographs down on the desk, one after the other, like cards. The first showed her, on the cellar camera, carrying the Barolo up the stone corridor. The second showed the small blue glass vial, sitting on a clean white cloth inside her staff locker. The third showed a drawer full of banded cash, a plastic bin of stuffed animals pushed to one side, in what she recognized instantly as her daughter's bedroom in Queens. She looked at the first photograph. She looked at the second. When her eyes came to the third, something inside her broke a little. She kept it inside. Her shoulders did not move. "The vial," Alessandro said. "Look at it." Sophia looked. She shook her head. Once, twice. Her voice cracked when she spoke, and she hated that it cracked. "I have never seen this thing before in my life." The money. She looked at the third photograph again, and this time, for the first time in the 4 months she had worked in his house, she raised her eyes and looked straight into his. "I swear on the soul of my daughter," she said. Her voice was low and very clear. "I did not do this." Alessandro believed her. He knew it in the same place he had always known things that could not be proven. He knew it the way a man knows the weight of his own gun. But he was the head of the Moretti family, and the head of the Moretti family did not allow a feeling to decide the fate of an organization. Behind Sophia, Marco was still standing at the door. Down the long corridor, on the other side of walls she could not see, the capos were waiting for a name and a room and an end. His voice, when it came, was dry as ash. "Marco, take her downstairs to the room on the lower level. She is not to be handled roughly. She does not leave this house until the investigation is finished." Sophia nodded, once, slowly. Then, very quietly, she asked, "And Emma?" The room on the lower level had never been given a name. It was not a cell. There were no bars. There was no bare bulb hanging from a wire. It had, over the years, held a business rival who needed to be kept out of sight, a nephew who needed to be sobered up, a lawyer who needed to be persuaded. The room had a single bed with a clean white cover, a small wooden table, a lamp with a warm yellow shade, a chair, and one narrow window set high in the wall that let in a strip of gray daylight. The door locked from the outside, and a guard stood in the corridor. Sophia was allowed to bring 3 things down with her: a change of clothes, folded neatly, 2 paperback books from her locker that she had not yet finished reading, and a small framed photograph of Emma taken on the front step of their building in Queens. Emma in her yellow raincoat, holding Sir Fluff by one ear. She set the photograph on the wooden table. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She placed her hands in her lap, on top of the folded change of clothes. She did not cry. She had learned, a long time before she had come to this house, that tears were a currency you did not spend in front of people who had not earned them. She looked at the photograph on the table. She looked at the ceiling. She waited. 2 floors above her, at the top of the 3rd floor staircase, Alessandro stood with one hand on the banister. He could hear Emma crying. The sound of her was small and thin and traveled up the marble stairwell, in a way sound was not supposed to travel in a house this large. She was calling for her mother. She was not screaming. She was doing something worse. She was calling in that steady, patient, disbelieving way. Small children call for something they are certain will come back, if they are only loud enough. Anna Marchetti, the doctor's wife, had been sent for. She was a soft-voiced woman in her 50s who had raised 3 children of her own, and she was very good at what she was being asked to do. She had lifted Emma up, carried her into the playroom on the 2nd floor, and offered her chocolate cookies from a small blue tin. Emma refused the cookies. She sat on the rug with Sir Fluff pressed tight against her chest, her cheeks blotched red, her eyes swollen. She did not throw a tantrum. She only kept asking, in a small, cracked voice, for her mother. Vincent Romano happened to walk past the open crack of the playroom door. He looked in only for a second, only because he could not help himself, and something moved across his face that no one was there to see. It was not concern. It was closer to horror. He turned away sharply, before Marco could round the corner, and he did not look back. That night, Alessandro did not sleep. There are orders a Mafia boss gives that echo in the war rooms of his enemies, and there are orders that echo only in his own conscience. Those are the ones that keep him awake. Long after the rest of the house had gone still, Alessandro walked down the corridor to his study and pushed the door open without turning on a light. Moonlight came in through the tall window behind the desk. It fell in a pale, silver rectangle across the wide floorboards and climbed the far wall until it reached the bookcase. There, on the 2nd shelf, in the exact middle of that patch of moonlight, sat Emma's painting. The paper was slightly warped where the water had dried. The flower listed a little to one side. The orange sun had too many rays, and one of the rays trailed off into nothing because the brush had run dry. The blue butterfly, if you could call it that, had wings of unequal size. It sat between the engraved crest of the Moretti family, cast in dark bronze on a mahogany stand, and a black and white photograph of his father, taken in 1987, wearing a dark suit and looking straight into the camera the way men from that generation looked at cameras as if the camera were a witness at a trial. Alessandro crossed the room without a sound and stopped in front of the shelf. He looked at the painting for a long time. He thought about Sophia. He thought about the small, careful nod she gave whenever he passed her in the hall, never quite meeting his eyes because she had been raised to believe that a housekeeper did not do that. He thought about the cup of tea that had begun appearing on his desk on the nights he worked late, always in the same china cup, always placed on a folded napkin, so it would not mark the wood, put there without a word, without a note, without a request for thanks. He thought about the afternoon Marco had walked into the playroom to speak to him about something, holster showing under an open jacket, and how Sophia had, without seeming to move at all, shifted her body between Marco and Emma, not with fear, with something older than fear, the plain animal calm of a mother closing a small distance. He thought about her eyes when she had said, "I swear on the soul of my daughter, that woman was not an assassin, but the evidence." He walked around the desk and sat down. He opened his laptop. The screen glow lit his face pale blue in the dark room. He pulled up the cellar corridor footage again. He watched Sophia walk down the stone passage with the Barolo. He watched her walk back. He rewound. He watched again. He played it at half speed. He played it frame by frame. There was nothing wrong with it, and that was the problem. He sat back in the chair. The moonlight had moved a little across the floor. The painting on the shelf was still lit, still lopsided, still absurdly hopeful. Something in the footage was not there that should have been. Something had been removed by someone who knew exactly what to remove. He did not know yet what it was. But he knew it was missing. Alessandro walked into the playroom in his stocking feet. He had left his shoes outside the door on purpose. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that children heard shoes differently than they heard people, and he did not want Emma to hear a man before she saw one. The morning light was coming in through the tall window in soft pale bands, and Emma was on the rug in the middle of the room, cross-legged, Sir Fluff pressed against her stomach with both arms. Her eyes were still puffy from the night before. She did not look up when he came in. She had learned, in the last several hours, that grown-ups walking through doors did not usually bring her mother back. He lowered himself onto the rug beside her, a man in a $3,000 dark suit, sitting on the floor of a playroom, one long leg folded under him, the other stretched out along the carpet. If Marco had walked in at that moment, he would have stopped in the doorway all over again. Alessandro did not ask about Sophia, not first. He picked up the corner of a small wooden puzzle piece on the rug and turned it over in his fingers. "Sir Fluff," he said. "How is he today?" Emma glanced sideways at him, cautious. "Tired," she said. "Yeah, me too." He nodded slowly. "What is his favorite color?" She thought about it. Her small brow furrowed the way it did when she was making a serious decision. "Purple. Good choice." They sat there for a while. He asked her about the puzzle. He asked her which crayon in the box was the one she used the most. He asked her, gently, about the party the other night, the evening. The important gentleman had gone home, and everyone had come downstairs, and Uncle Moretti had gotten sick. Emma tilted her head. She thought about it the way 3-year-olds think, with the whole of her small body. Then she said, in a small and trusting voice, "Uncle Vincent put the blue water in the cup." Alessandro did not move. Emma was looking down at Sir Fluff. She kept talking without noticing what she had just done. "I saw. Mama went to get me more water." Uncle Vincent took a little bottle out of his pocket. It was blue. He put in some drops. Then he smiled at me and he told me not to say. He said it was a fun secret. She looked up. "Is that okay?" Alessandro did not answer for a long moment. His face did not change. Nothing on the outside of him moved. But inside, everything in the last 3 days, the tray, the wine, the fall, the vial in the locker, the money in the drawer, the woman on the other side of the desk, saying, "I swear on the soul of my daughter," all of it stopped in one place, lifted, and set itself down again in an entirely different order. He reached out very slowly and rested a hand on Sir Fluff's soft ear. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "That is okay. The greatest witnesses in this world are the ones nobody thinks to interview because they cannot yet write, cannot yet lie, and cannot yet be bribed by anyone." Vincent Romano was summoned to the study. Marco delivered the message himself, in the corridor, in the low voice that men used inside this house when they did not want the walls to hear. He did not say why. He did not need to. Vincent set down the silver cloth he had been polishing, straightened his cuffs the way he always did before entering a room where Alessandro was, and walked down the long hallway with the same measured pace he had used for 30 years. Marco was waiting at the study door. He opened it, let Vincent step through, and then closed it behind him without going in. He did not sit down. He remained standing against the closed door on the inside of the room, one hand resting lightly, almost thoughtfully, on the grip of the small handgun in his shoulder holster. Alessandro was seated in the leather armchair by the window. On his lap, curled sideways with her cheek against the lapel of his suit, and Sir Fluff clutched to her chest, was Emma. She was half asleep. She had not been told anything about anything. Vincent stopped 2 steps into the room. Something moved across his face that could not be hidden and did not know it was showing. His color drained. The small silver crucifix that hung on a thin chain against his shirt front, the one Alessandro's father had placed in his hand 30 years ago, trembled with the sudden, shallow rise and fall of his breath. He had no material evidence in front of him, only the word of a 3-year-old asleep on the boss's chest. But every man in that room understood exactly what was happening. "Vincent," Alessandro said. His voice was very quiet. "Sit down." Vincent sat down. The chair across from Alessandro was a straight-backed thing with a hard seat. He lowered himself onto it as if his knees had suddenly decided they were 62 years old after all. Alessandro looked at him for a long time. Then, without raising his voice, without changing the calm of it, he repeated Emma's words, every one of them, in the exact order she had said them. He put in some drops. He smiled at me and he told me not to say. He said it was a fun secret. Vincent listened. His hands were folded together in his lap. As Alessandro spoke, those hands closed on each other, one squeezing the other, harder and harder, until the knuckles went white and the veins stood up along the backs of them like small ropes. He did not deny it. He did not open his mouth to argue. He did not lift his eyes. The tears started then. They were not the tears of a guilty man caught in the light. They were the tears of a man who had been living somewhere without light for a very long time and had, until this moment, been holding his breath in the dark. He let out one broken sound, half a word, then his lips moved. "Boss," he whispered. His voice cracked on the small English word he had used for 30 years. "Boss. They have Danny. Danny, his grandson, 10 years old, the son of the daughter Vincent had buried 3 winters ago." Vincent told him everything. He told it slowly, in pieces, in the way a man tells the truth when he has been carrying it inside his ribs like a stone. His voice was not the voice Alessandro had known for 30 years. It was smaller. It was older. It kept cracking at the edges of certain words, and then trying, without much success, to smooth itself out again. It had started with a phone call, a number he did not recognize, a man's voice on the other end, calm, unhurried, faintly polite. That voice had said, without preamble, that it knew Vincent loved Danny more than anyone else on the earth. That voice had not raised itself once during the entire conversation. 2 hours later, a photograph had arrived on his phone. Danny, 10 years old, sitting on a concrete floor in a room with no windows, wrists bound in front of him, a strip of tape across his mouth. The photograph had a timestamp burned into the corner of it. The demand was 1 sentence long. He was to poison Alessandro in a way that would put the blame on Sophia Delgado. Vincent had done it in pieces, over days, the way a man walks toward the edge of a bridge when he does not want to look down. He had slipped the small blue glass vial into Sophia's staff locker one afternoon while she was at the market, using the master key that had been on his belt for 3 decades. He had planted the $25,000 in her apartment in Queens on a Tuesday, when Marco had sent him across the river to deliver a sealed envelope to a lawyer on the same block. He had asked to be given the wine service for the Chicago meeting himself. He had opened the Barolo. He had waited for the moment when the housekeeper would step out to fetch a glass of water for the boss. He had done it, all of it, with his own hands, so that Danny would live. Alessandro did not interrupt him. When Vincent finished, there was a silence in the room that felt like the silence in a church after the last note of an organ has ended. Emma slept on, curled against Alessandro's chest, Sir Fluff pressed under her small chin. Alessandro stood up slowly. He handed the sleeping child, with a gentleness that even Marco would remember for the rest of his life, into the arms of Marco, who received her without a word and stepped back toward the door. Then Alessandro did something Marco had never in his life seen him do. He knelt. He lowered himself onto one knee in front of Vincent's chair, at eye level with the old man, and he reached out and took Vincent's 2 shaking hands in his own. His voice, when he spoke, was low and hard. "A name. Who called you?" Vincent looked at him for a long time. The silver crucifix trembled again on its chain. His lips moved once without sound. Then, in a voice that came apart at the seam, "Lucas." Alessandro went very still. Lucas Moretti, his own cousin, Uncle Roberto's boy. The child he had eaten Christmas dinner with every year since Lucas was 12. The man he had trusted with the entire Brooklyn waterfront. Alessandro rose from his knee. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise anything, but every man in that room felt the temperature of it change. Marco. Marco was already moving. He had transferred Emma back into her mother's crib in his memory the second Alessandro spoke the name Lucas, and he was ready. "Bring Sophia up. Now. And put 2 teams together. We are going to find the boy." Marco set Emma down carefully on the small sofa by the window, tucked Sir Fluff into the crook of her arm, and stepped out of the study with his phone already in his hand. Vincent remained in the chair, his shoulders bent, silent tears still running down his face into the collar of his shirt. Marco went down the back stairs 2 at a time. Something was wrong before he reached the bottom. The corridor lights on the lower level had been switched off. Only the emergency strip along the baseboard was on, casting a low white glow along the floor. At the end of that corridor, the door to the small room was standing open. Bruno, the man on watch, was on the floor. Marco was on him in 3 strides. Bruno was still breathing, slow and shallow. There was a tiny puncture mark on the side of his neck, and the pupil in the one eye Marco pulled open was fixed and huge. Tranquilizer. Fast acting. Professional grade. The room beyond was empty. The bed was made. The photograph of Emma on the small table had been left standing exactly where Sophia had placed it, as if she had not been given the time or the choice to take it with her. Marco was up the stairs before his own next breath. He passed the study door, kept going, took the second staircase up to the second floor, and pushed the playroom door open with the flat of his hand. The rug in the center of the room was empty. Sir Fluff was lying on his side in the middle of it. One long ear flopped across the pile. Marco was down the corridor and at the service entrance in seconds. The heavy back door of the staff quarters was standing a hand's width open. The alarm keypad was dark. The system had not been forced. It had been switched off properly, correctly, with a valid entry code. A code that only members of the Moretti family were given. He came back into the main living room at something close to a run. Alessandro was already standing there, in the exact center of the room, in front of the black sofa where Emma had painted flowers on his face days before. Something in his face had gone very still. The house, 6 stories, 30 rooms, had suddenly closed in around him until it felt no larger than the 4 walls of a closet. He had been slower than Lucas. By minutes, only by minutes. "Front gate camera," Marco said, and his voice was as flat as a table. "Black Escalade, rear plate is fake, turned south, heading toward Brooklyn." The landline on the desk in the study rang. The sound was old-fashioned and slow, the kind of ring that belonged to a heavy black telephone from another decade. Very few people in the world had that number. The screen on the base showed no incoming caller, a blocked line. Marco stepped past Alessandro to the desk. He pressed a small recessed button under the lip of the drawer, and a soft red light bloomed on the recording unit that was wired into the base of the receiver. He nodded once. "Ready." Alessandro picked up the phone. He did not speak first. He never did. The voice on the other end was one he had known since it had been a boy's voice. He had heard it laughing across long dining tables at Christmas. He had heard it swearing on the deck of a boat off Sheepshead Bay one summer when its owner had been 15. He had heard it saying grace over a plate at Uncle Roberto's funeral. It was the same voice, and it was not the same voice at all. Something under it had gone soft in the way old fruit goes soft. Alessandro said nothing. "I have 2 people who belong to you," Lucas said. He said it pleasantly, the way another man might have offered coffee. "A housekeeper, whom the entire organization believes to be a traitor, and a very small child. 3 years old, I am told. Yellow raincoat. Very pretty." Alessandro's hand on the receiver did not tighten. His knuckles did not go white. Nothing in his face moved at all. "Warehouse 7, Lucas said. "Red Hook waterfront, you know the one. It used to belong to Uncle Roberto before you gave it to me. You will come alone. No weapons. No men. You will bring with you a signed transfer of full operational control of the Moretti family. Notarized, in your own hand. Once I have that paper, I let them walk out." There was a small pause. "If you bring even 1 man with you, cousin, I will shoot the little one first, in front of her mother. Do we understand each other?" The line went dead. Alessandro set the receiver down onto its cradle, with more care than the moment required. He looked at the black phone for a long second. Then he lifted his head. Raphael Bianchi had just come in through the study door. He was 40 years old, built like something built for a purpose, the head of Alessandro's personal security detail. He had been in a car halfway across Midtown when the emergency signal had gone out, and he had made the drive in a time that no one was going to write down. "Raphael, boss, all 3 teams, everything we have, Warehouse 7, Red Hook." Raphael waited. "No one leaves that warehouse alive," Alessandro said, "except Sophia and Emma. Are we clear?" Raphael did not blink. He nodded once, a short, hard motion of the head, and turned back toward the door. His phone was already at his ear before he crossed the threshold. Somewhere out beyond the walls of the estate, in garages and safe houses and quiet apartments across 5 boroughs, the Moretti war machine began, very quietly, to move. Red Hook, Brooklyn. Cold rain came in off the black water of the bay in flat, sideways sheets. The wind carried the smell of salt and diesel and old brick. Warehouse 7 sat on the very edge of the pier, a 3-story shell of rusted steel and boarded windows that had not held a legitimate shipment in years. Its walls had gone the color of dried blood in the streetlight. Its roof sagged in one corner where a beam had given up. 2 blocks away, 3 black cars pulled to the curb inside a narrow alley with their headlights off. Doors opened and closed with the practiced quiet of men who had done this before. Raphael Bianchi stood beside the lead vehicle, rain running along the brim of his cap, and split his men with 3 short movements of his hand. Team 1, up the fire escape on the east wall, onto the roof, in through the skylight. Team 2, along the waterside, into the loading tunnel that fed the sublevel from the west. Alessandro and Marco, front doors, straight down the middle, two of Raphael's best walking, a half step behind them. Under his black suit, Alessandro wore a Kevlar vest that fit like a second skin. 2 handguns rode against his ribs. A short blade sat in a leather sheath along the inside of his belt. He wore no coat. He wanted to see, and he wanted to be seen. Marco pushed the loading door open on its hinges. Inside, the warehouse opened into a wide central bay that had once held pallets and forklifts and shipping crates the size of small rooms. Most of that was gone now. In the middle of the empty floor, a single work light on a metal stand threw a hard yellow circle onto the concrete. Lucas Moretti stood inside that circle, 34 years old, thinner than Alessandro remembered. His cheekbones had sharpened. His eyes were too bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lamp, a wet, glassy shine that suggested something chemical had already gone through him tonight. Behind him, roped to a steel pillar by wrists and waist, was Sophia. A strip of gray tape covered her mouth. Her hair had come loose. Her eyes did not leave Alessandro's face. To her left, a wooden crate had been dragged into the light. Emma sat inside it, folded small, both arms wrapped around Sir Fluff. She was not crying. She had gone into that particular quiet children go into when the world stops making sense and they have decided, without being told, that it is safer to hold on to something soft and wait. Lucas smiled. His teeth were very white in the yellow light. "You are early, cousin. I thought you would want to negotiate first." Alessandro did not answer. He was looking above Lucas, along the 2 steel catwalks that ran the length of the warehouse 30 feet above the floor, and behind the tops of the stacked shelving units at the far walls. Small, dark shapes had positioned themselves. He counted. 8 rifles, enough to let Lucas believe he had won this room. Not nearly enough to actually win it. The first shot came from the roof. It was a single, clean crack that traveled through the skylight and put the rifleman on the north catwalk down in one motion before he could turn toward the sound. Raphael's signal. The rest of the warehouse tore open a heartbeat later. Muzzle flashes bloomed along the edges of the shelving units on the west wall as Team 2 came up through the loading tunnel and opened on the second catwalk. From the roof, Team 1 dropped through the broken skylight and ropes, guns already trained. Alessandro's 2 men beside him moved as one, driving Marco backward toward the cover of a steel beam, and Alessandro drew both handguns from beneath his vest in a single practiced motion. The 8 riflemen who were supposed to hold this room began to fall. They fell in 1s and 2s. They fell in the way men fall when they have been outnumbered from the beginning and have only just discovered it. Sound stacked on sound until there was no separating individual gunfire from the roar of it. In the middle of that circle of yellow light, Lucas Moretti understood. Something in his face gave up first. It was not fear. It was the empty, private rage of a man who has spent his whole life planning for a moment and has just watched that moment be taken apart in front of him. He turned toward the wooden crate. He raised the small handgun in his right hand. Sophia saw it before anyone else. She began to scream against the tape across her mouth, a sound that was not a word but was every word she had ever known. Emma looked up. She saw the barrel. She did not know what it was. She only knew that the man in the yellow light was pointing something at her, and that her mother had begun to make a sound she had never heard her mother make before. Her arms tightened around Sir Fluff. From the shadow behind the stacked shelving on the west wall, the shelving that no one on the Moretti side had cleared because there had been no reason to clear it, because the man who might have been hiding there was supposed to be under guard back at the estate, Vincent Romano stepped out. 62 years old. His hands were shaking. In his right hand he held an old revolver, blued and worn, the one Alessandro's father had pressed into his palm 30 years ago along with the silver crucifix that still hung against his shirt. He had slipped out of the estate after the interrogation. He had followed Marco's car in a cab, at a distance. He had walked in through the waterside door on Raphael's flank in the dark, unseen. He had made his choice long before he crossed this floor. He fired twice. Both rounds took Lucas in the center of the chest. Lucas staggered. His finger closed on the trigger one last time before his heart understood that it was over. The final bullet from his gun crossed the yellow light and struck Vincent low in the stomach. Vincent went down onto the concrete. The silver crucifix tore free from its chain and skidded across the bloody floor. Alessandro was running before Vincent hit the ground. He dropped to both knees beside the old man and gathered him up. Vincent's mouth moved. His voice came in broken pieces. "The child. Protect the child. The way I protected you. Some men live their entire lives in shadow, waiting for one moment where they can step into the light even if that light costs them everything they have left." Mount Sinai Hospital. The surgical wing was on the 9th floor. A private corridor at the end of a private hallway. guarded quietly at both ends by men in dark coats who were not hospital security and did not pretend to be. The lights in the waiting corridor had been dimmed for the night. The floor tiles gave back the low green glow of the exit signs. Vincent's surgery lasted a long time. Alessandro sat on one of the hard plastic chairs against the wall for most of it, his elbows braced on his knees, his hands loose between them. There was still dried blood on the cuff of his shirt from the concrete floor of the warehouse. He had not noticed it. Marco stood nearby, saying nothing. Raphael came and went with quiet updates from the perimeter. Then, at last, the double doors of the operating suite swung outward, and Dr. Elias Marchetti walked into the corridor. He was in surgical scrubs. He pulled the mask down from his face and let it hang around his neck. "He lives," Marchetti said. "It will be slow. He will not be young again. But he lives." Alessandro closed his eyes for a single breath. He did not answer. Danny had already been in the building for over an hour. Raphael's second team had cleared a small basement apartment in the Bronx that same night, moving door by door through a narrow stairwell with silenced weapons, and had found the boy in a windowless back room, wrists and ankles bound, mouth taped, hungry and cold and afraid, but not otherwise harmed. They had cut him free. They had put a coat around him. They had driven him to the same hospital where his grandfather was being cut open on a table 2 floors above. Danny was on the surgical floor now, sitting in a plastic chair pulled close to the recovery bed, holding Vincent's slack hand in both of his own. Down the corridor, near the elevators, Sophia was sitting on a padded bench along the wall with Emma folded across her lap. Emma had finally, at some point in the drive back through the tunnel, dropped into an exhausted sleep. Her cheek was pressed against her mother's shoulder. A streak of dust from the wooden crate still ran along the side of her small face. Sophia had not tried to clean it off. She was afraid to move her arms. Alessandro walked down the corridor to the bench and stopped a step in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something none of the men in the hallway had ever seen him do to another human being. He bowed his head. "I saw 3 pieces of evidence," he said. His voice was low and honest, and I believed them. "I did not believe you. You are the woman who brought her daughter into my house and gave that house the thing it had been missing for 20 years. I gave the order to put you in that room. I let you sit in the basement of my house, while the man who had actually done it walked freely on the floors above you. There is no way for me to undo that. But I am sorry." Sophia's eyes filled and did not spill. She did not tell him she forgave him. She only lifted one hand from around her sleeping daughter and reached out and closed it around his. 4 small fingers, warm, real. The Moretti estate on the Upper East Side had never known this kind of light. Golden afternoon sun poured in through the tall front windows of the living room, warming the marble floor where a broken teapot had once shattered and a small paintbrush had once rested. On the long black leather sofa in the center of the room, Alessandro Moretti sat with one arm stretched along the back cushion and the other resting easily against his knee. He was not asleep. He was not exhausted. He was laughing. At his feet, cross-legged on the most expensive Persian rug in the country, sat Emma. She was slightly bigger than she had been on the day she had first opened her watercolor set in this same room, but only slightly. A new set of paints lay open in front of her, and she was working on a picture with the kind of quiet, tongue-out concentration that had once painted flowers on a sleeping face. This picture was not a lopsided flower. It was a family, a tall man in a dark suit, a woman with curly hair and a soft smile, a very small girl holding a paintbrush like a wand, and behind them, standing a little to the side as though he were watching over the whole scene, an old man with a small silver cross around his neck, cradling a bouquet of yellow flowers in his arms. Sophia stepped into the room from the hallway, carrying a silver tray. She was not wearing a housekeeper's uniform. She had not worn one in months. She wore a soft cotton dress with a small floral print, and her curly hair was down. She set the tray on the low coffee table and, without ceremony, sat down on the sofa beside Alessandro. Not as an employee crossing a room she cleaned, but as a woman easing into a place that had become her own. Vincent Romano lived on Long Island now. He had retired quietly, and with more honor than most men who had served the Moretti family had ever been given. Alessandro had bought him a small house near the water, with a garden and a room with a good window for Danny. Every Sunday, Vincent came into the city. The silver crucifix he wore around his neck still carried the faint darkened stain of that night in the warehouse, a stain he refused, every time, to wash away. It was, he had told Danny once, the price of the trust he had almost broken and had been given a chance to earn again. Marco Ricci was still at Alessandro's side. The Moretti Empire still stood, its ports, its houses, its long shadow across the boroughs. But the man who came home each evening was no longer the man he had been. Alessandro looked down at Emma's painting. He remembered the afternoon a very small girl had bent over his sleeping face and painted a yellow flower on his cheek. He remembered the first time in years he had cried in front of a mirror. He remembered a soft, matter-of-fact voice in a playroom saying, "Uncle Vincent put the blue water in the cup," and how those innocent words had saved 3 lives, one of them his own. We spend our lives building empires, walls of money, walls of power, walls of blood. And then one quiet afternoon, a tiny girl in a yellow raincoat walks into your fortress, looks at your sleeping face, and shows you that the door was never locked. It was only that no one small enough, kind enough, or honest enough had ever tried to walk through it. If this story taught us anything, beautiful souls, it is this: the most dangerous walls we build are the ones we build around our own hearts. And the ones who finally break through are almost never the ones we are guarding against. Sometimes it is a child. Sometimes it is a kind stranger. Sometimes it is a moment of grace we did not know we were still allowed to have. Do not miss it when it comes. If this story touched something inside of you, please tap the like button. It truly helps us more than you know. If you are new here, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Now tell me in the comments, which moment stayed with you the most? Was it Alessandro seeing his painted face in the mirror? Was it Emma's small voice in the playroom? Was it Vincent stepping out of the shadows with the silver cross around his neck? Have you ever had a moment in your own life where someone small or unexpected quietly changed you? I read every comment, and I would love to hear your story too. Take good care of yourselves, beautiful souls. I wish you strong health, a peaceful heart, and joy in every ordinary day. Goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next story.